Hello, the alarm from 2620 is active. Today we will discuss about classes in Java. But before that, if you are new to my channel, please subscribe. And if you like the video, like, comment and share. So classes in Java are core of Java. That means it is the backbone of Java. If you have noticed in our exercises before this lecture, even though we used only one class, always our main method is included inside a class. So methods cannot be used by themselves. Class is the backbone of Java programming language, and sometimes it's described as the butter and bread of Java. So they are very critical. This is our first lecture on classes. We will have continued lectures elaborating further topics, the most important constructs of the language, including inheritance, polymorphism, and so on. Java language is constructed on the basis of classes. Okay, so everything used in Java is encapsulated in Java classes. The Java class is a backbone of Java programming language. It is the basis or the foundation for object-oriented programming. As you remember, in our class discussion on data types, we have also discussed the data type that a user can define. One of them is classes. So you can look into the data types lecture. The link is included in the description. And we use classes as one data type. That is a reference data type. And we create classes using a specific construct to be used as a template to create objects. When we say a template, it is like a blueprint. For example, if you have, let's take an example of a house. If a municipality is using a blueprint as a requirement for construction of villas in a certain part of a city as the minimum standard for constructing a house, so everybody who wants to construct the house should use that blueprint. So that blueprint is used as a guide to build houses, okay, different houses, number of houses. Like that, classes are used as blueprint to create a number of objects as much as we want. Okay, so classes are very important concepts to understand in Java. So when we create classes, we can create another class inside a class. We call them nested classes or inner classes. So when we create classes, as we have discussed, we are creating the blueprint. So how do we define classes or create the blueprint? So to create the blueprint, we start with the word class. Okay, so we have to start with the word class in a small letter. This should be in small letters. Okay, then we will follow it with the class name, and the class name should be a valid identifier, and there are conventions which are recommended, but they are not a must or requirement to follow, but they are recommended. When we create class names, it is recommended to start with a capital letter. So if we create a class called person, P is recommended to be capital. And if we are using two words in creating class name, it's recommended to use camel case. It's called camel case. That means the first letter of each word should be capital, and that is termed as camel case format or naming. for classes. And then we will follow with an opening and closing curly braces. Inside those curly braces, we define the fields or variables of a class which define the characteristics of a class, and we also define methods. Methods define the behavior or how a class behaves or acts during when it's called or used in codes or after it is created. And then we also include constructors. By default, Java provides a default constructor to all classes, okay, with no parameters. Once we define a constructor, we have to mention explicitly which constructor we are using when we define new objects. Okay, so how do we create it? Here we have got the word class in the beginning and then class name. So that is a way we define classes when we create the template. Then we follow them with an opening and closing curly braces, and inside these curly braces we define fields or instance variables, and uh, they can be defined with an access modifier, which is optional but it is recommended. We will discuss about access modifiers in subsequent lectures. And then we have to define type that is required. The type is the data type, as we have said. You can look into the lecture that we have done before, and then we define the identifier. That's called field or instance variable. Then we can add constructors. As we have said, constructors are provided by default by the Java language, but when we want to define a constructor with specific definition, we have to explicitly define that one. And the default constructor is without parameters. So when we define a new parameter, a new constructor, we can include parameters. These are arguments that will be used when we initialize the class during its creation or its initialization. So that is constructors. We will discuss about them in a bit. The other thing that we can define in classes is method. Okay, methods. So they define the behavior of a class, and here we can use access modifiers and followed by a type. So the type can be the data types that we have discussed in our previous lecture, and in method type definition there is also another type called void, and when we say void it means that the method doesn't return any value or any type. So the methods can be without parameters or we can have parameters as we like. When we create objects, that means when we initialize classes we are creating objects, okay, using the template. So we define them like any variable. Yeah, you can look into the discussion on variables. There are two ways of creating objects. uh, the first is we create the identifier. That means we define the variable and then we can initialize it on the same line or we can initialize it in a different line. Okay, so when we initialize classes we have to use the new keyword before we initialize with the constructor. This will the new keyword will allocate memory in stack and to initialize the object. Okay, and the identifier will be used as a reference. That means it points to the memory where the object is created. So that's how we define classes: the class name and then the variable name or identifier, then we initialize them by using the new keyword followed by the class name, that is the constructor. The constructor can have arguments. If we have to mention them. If we don't have, it will be empty parentheses. Okay, so for example, if you have a class called person and you define the identifier to be person1, then you initialize the person class with person constructor preceded by the new keyword. This will create a new object called person1. Okay, we can also create another object called person2 with the same syntax. So when we create objects, we need also to access the fields methods of the class or the object that we have initialized. And after initialization, we use the dot operator to access the fields or methods of a class. It's called dot operator. Uh, it is the period punctuation that is used as a dot operator. So after the identifier of the class that we have used to create the object, we put the dot operator, then we will access the fields and methods if they are public. That means we will discuss about access modifiers later. So if we define the fields and methods to be accessed inside the class or indirectly, then we cannot access them with a dot operator. We have to access them with another way using a method which is accessible. Okay, so that's what the next statement is saying. Access to the instance fields or methods could be indirect. Okay, if we apply access modifiers that limit access of the class field and methods. Sometimes we use methods which need to be used while we are defining the class, but we access them with another method. So we can do that if we want to um, access the instance fields and methods with a dot operator, but the ideal recommendation is encapsulating those data within the class and accessing them indirectly. We will discuss about encapsulation, the concept of encapsulation in object-oriented programming in subsequent lectures. So as we have created an object called person1 in the previous slides, so we can use to access the, for example, the gender. If we define a variable describing gender, then we can say person1 dot gender. That's how we access the fields if they are accessible in the object. Okay, and if we want to use the method also, we will use the method name after the dot operator like this. Calculate age is a method. It can have arguments or it might not. Okay, if we have defined parameters when we create the blueprint or the class, then we have to put arguments here. So arguments are um, values included in the place of parameters when we call the method or use the method. So what is a constructor? Let's have a little more discussion about constructors here. So a constructor is a special type of method that always need to be defined by the name of the class, and they will not have access modifiers. Okay, they will be used only with the name of the class. Okay, so there is no definition of return type or data type because constructors are supposed to return the class, okay, that type by default. So we don't need to specify the type of the constructor. We call only with the name of the class. Okay, it can have arguments or parameters, and then when we call them we add arguments. Okay, so as we have discussed, if we have supplied a constructor, we have to be explicit when we create objects. We have to use those constructors. Okay, the default constructor supplied by Java will be overridden when we define explicit constructors. So constructors are responsible to initialize the object with what new before them when we create the object. And if we use parameters, we supply arguments to initialize the instance fields or characteristics of a class. Okay, and one of the important concepts in Java class creation is um, garbage collection. Garbage collection is the dynamic or automatic uh, clearing of memory by the Java virtual machine while the program is executing when the class we have defined is no more required or needed in the program execution. So in other programming languages like C and C++, when we want to remove those objects, we have to be explicit and use the word delete to delete those objects that we have or memories that we have allocated. But in Java, the garbage collection mechanism defined in the virtual machine that is used to run the bytecode will remove those memories allocated and which are no more needed in the program execution. So that's it for this video. Thank you for your time.